Hey everybody, welcome back to Jim's Garage. In this video, we're going to be revisiting Headscale. That's the open source, self-hosted variant of Tailscale. The good news is you can use all of the native Tailscale apps to connect to your own Headscale instance. The reason I'm doing this is because in the next video, I'm going to be showing you how to create a remote cloud NAS. What's that? Well, effectively, I have some NASs that were sent to me by Ugreen, but this is applicable to any old hardware you have lying around, or even new hardware if you want, and you want to escape things like a cloud service fee, or you want to keep things owned by yourself. So I'll be using Headscale to create a remote connection to my NAS that I could have anywhere, a friend's house, a relative, or even a co-location. That would enable me to have a secure connection to that device, and now because I've got fast internet, I could treat that as though it's basically on my LAN. So before we do that, we're going to go down the Headscale route. Now I've done this before in a previous video, so I'm going to quickly go over some of the theory, but if you want to hear more about that theory and how it works and how it's a mesh VPN, all those sorts of things, go and check out that video, and also check out the documentation because a few things have changed since I've done that. That was about 9 months ago. In this video, I'm going to show you the UI though. In the last video, I was more into the command line interface, which I do recommend you go and learn because you should know how this thing works. Now, the UI is not perfect. I'll be showing you two different UIs for this video. One which is called Headscale UI, good name. One which is called Headscale Admin. Now, the admin has more features, but the features are broken. Hopefully that will be fixed soon. The Headscale UI has fewer features, but it does work. Hopefully that will be expanded in the future. Anyway, by the end of this video, you'll have Headscale up and running. I'll show you how to connect things like an Android device and another Linux box. We'll have a quick look at routes so we can make sure that we can route traffic between our different nodes. And we'll also have a look at setting the exit nodes. So yeah, that's right. We could treat each of our devices as an exit node, a bit like a traditional VPN. So for example, if you did put this at a different region, even a different country, or even in somewhere like a co-location, you could route different traffic from different nodes and use that one as an exit node. Really powerful tool. For this demonstration, we're going to be deploying this in Docker, but there's no reason you couldn't deploy this on an LXC, a VM, or even bare metal if you wanted to. So let's now hop into VS Code, let's have a look at the Docker Compose file, and then we'll get into deploying it and configuring it. Now, to get this up and running is pretty straightforward, but there are a few things you need to be comfortable with depending on how you set this up. So off the bat, all we really need to do is set up the Docker Compose file, which you can see on screen here. And there's also a configuration file, config.yaml, that we also need to set up. So let's run through the Compose file first, and then we'll have a look at the config.yaml. So in this deployment, I have two containers. I actually have three, but two of those are just different UIs. So you can pick and choose which one you want, or remove the UI if you simply want to go down the CLI route. So I'm using version 0.23-alpha 12. Now that's because there hasn't been a major release of Headscale for about a year now, but between that last major release and now, there's been 12 alphas. Now, from reading the GitHub, it looks like a new major release, or at least a major beta, will be coming out soon, so that's really good to see. But from my testing and usability, the fact that it's been an alpha version, I haven't noticed any issues. The only issues I have noticed are through the UI. That's probably because the alphas keep changing things like the APIs, which the UIs resolve on. So the container name, Headscale, pretty straightforward. Restart unless stopped, and I've set the time zone to be Europe, London. Now this requires two volumes. Now for this instance, I've just used the ./conf, which means it's going to create this folder in this folder here. So don't worry about why I've called it Headscale and Headscale 2. That's just for my old video, my original Headscale. I've just called this one Headscale 2. So in there, it's just got the .conf file. Obviously, if you don't want it in this location, you can put it somewhere else. And it also uses a Docker volume, headscale-data, which it will create. Again, if you don't want to use a Docker volume, you can obviously use a bind mount and just specify a folder location that you want on your machine. Now the entry point is it's going to do Headscale serve, so it's going to basically spin this up and serve as a Tailscale implementation. And it's going to be on my network of proxy, That's because I want to run this through a reverse proxy. You don't have to do that, but I recommend you do so that you get nice certificates. So then we get on to your standard traffic labels, more or less. Having a look down, you'll see that we put it on the proxy network, which is the name of the network I have my traffic reverse proxy on. It's served on port 8080. It's got a URL, which I use here. It redirects to HTTPS. I've specified the cert resolver, and I've created the service Headscale. I'm deliberately going over these quickly because I've covered these many times before, but do check out my traffic video if you're struggling for some of these concepts. Now, the bit that's really important here, especially if you're going to be running both the Tailscale or Headscale in this instance and the UI on different subdomains, you need to be aware of CORS. That's for cross-origin. If you don't set this up properly, you'll get an error with the UI because Tailscale or Headscale, sorry, it's getting a bit confusing. It's just because I call this implementation Tailscale and I use the other one Headscale down here. If you don't do that, Headscale is going to say, no, you're not coming from the right subdomain. And this is a security feature to stop redirects and unknown origin traffic. So the only bit really here you need to make sure is, if we have a look on the right hand side, the allow origins list here. So you need to put in here, this needs to be the URL of whatever you put down below in the UI section. So scrolling down on here, you can see that I've set up, here's the first UI, which I'm not going to use. Here's the second UI. You can see that for the Headscale UI here, this container here, you can see that the URL it's going to be on in traffic is Headscale. So whatever that is, you simply need to put it into this cross origin just here, unless you're going to be using the same subdomain for both. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to break these things up. That's how you need to do it. After that, we just set up the load balancer port. So this is going to be set up for UDP traffic for DERP 41641 and 3478. That's it. That should be enough to get you up and running with Headscale. So as I mentioned here, there are two UIs. This is Headscale Admin, which is a separate project that's been spun up. And if you uncomment all of this here, this will work and you'll be able to access that. Like I said in my introduction, this one doesn't seem to be working as well with the new API, which is what I suspect is happening here. But for actual features and what's available on the website, this actually has more features. So on this, you can do things like adding routes and entry points and all those sorts of things. On the Headscale UI, you can't do that and you need to dive back into the CLI. So hopefully this will get fixed in the future and hopefully it will reintroduce all of that functionality again. Now, the one that is more stable and works for all the features it says it does is the Headscale UI. Now, this again is pulling the latest image. It's going to sit on that proxy network and then it's going to sit on headscale.gymsgarage. And that's all we need to do to get this to work. Down here, we specify that the proxy is external because it was created elsewhere. It was created when I set up my traffic. And there's that volume for that Headscale data. Again, you don't need that if you're going to use a bind mount. Once you've got that all set up and configured, you need to get onto the config.yaml. So the config.yaml, this is just the default one taken from their website. I'm not going to go through this exhaustively. I've done that before. But effectively, you want to set your server URL to the URL that you specified in your Docker Compose for the Headscale server. I've just called this one Tailscale. The listen address, it tells you here, for production, you basically want it to listen to any address that's incoming. Same for the metrics. And then for the gRPC, this is for remote controlling it. I've also set that to any. I've said that it can't be insecure because you wouldn't want that to be insecure because it's going to control your instance. And then all of the rest of the things in here, I've just left as they are. I do recommend checking out my previous video, and I do recommend highly that you read through the documentation for any additional options that you want. There are things in here that if you change from the default could introduce some security risks, but there might be reasons or there might be times when you do actually want to change some stuff in here. You know what you're doing. You have different layers of security in place that might make you okay to change some of this stuff. By default, this is going to use a SQLite database. Now, as I've mentioned in other videos before, SQLite is fine at small scale, but it becomes troublesome. It's not performant, doesn't scale well when you have lots of data, lots of users, entry points, etc. Now, as I'm only going to have a handful of people ever on my Headscale, this should be fine for me, and I've not had any problems in the past. But if you're going to be doing this at scale, you probably want to introduce a different type of database. You can also do TLS setup within the configuration file. I don't have to do this because I'm letting my proxy take care of all this, and I recommend you do something similar. But if you were going to do this and you weren't going to put it behind a reverse proxy, you would need to get some certificates, and thankfully there is built-in Let's Encrypt support within this, and you could set this up similar to how I've done it with traffic in the past. You can set some DNS here if you just want to use DNS by default, but you can also override DNS when you actually go into the respective Tailscale apps. Outside of that, there are a ton more options, but I don't think they're going to be relevant for most people's configurations, albeit I do recommend you go and have a look through all of this and understand exactly what is available to you. So now that we have all of the configuration files understood, let's get into the deployment. Like I said, I'll be deploying both of these UIs so that I can show you the difference between the two, and then we'll get on to configuring Tailscale and getting some clients on there. Sorry, I keep saying Tailscale, I mean Headscale. Okay, so heading over into the terminal, let's get this thing up and running. So I'm going to navigate to that folder, and I'm then going to do a sudo docker compose up-d, and it's going to pull those containers. Like I say, this is actually going to pull both of those UIs. You only need to use one, but this is just for demonstration purposes. Should be pretty quick because it's actually quite lightweight. Now, those have all pulled and those have all started. That's excellent, and we can also see that on here. You can also manage Docker through VS Code, which is pretty awesome. But I'm going to hop over now into Portainer just because I love their friendly interface. Okay, so over in Portainer, you can see that I've got Headscale here, and then I've got Headscale Admin and Headscale UI, the two respective different UIs. If we have a look in the logs for Headscale, everything seems to be fine. It's saying that a new version of Headscale has been found, Alpha 9 versus Alpha 12. That's obviously an error. 12 is later than 9. And it has created a new private key for the noise because we didn't specify one in the config file. You can obviously create your own if you wanted to. It's using the SQLite database, and then it's listening on all of the ports and the interfaces that we specified, which is awesome. In the Headscale admin log, you can see here that everything's created. It's only listening on HTTP. That's fine because we're using it behind traffic with SSL, and there were no errors when creating this container. If we have a look in the UI, that's a similar story. May be vulnerable to abuse because TLS is enabled, but no protections are in place. But we've got this again behind our reverse proxy. Everything looks fine here, so fingers crossed we're in a position to access these URLs and access the UIs. Now, obviously, you're going to need to add those URLs to your DNS server. So I've added those to my Pi-hole. Whatever you're using, just make sure you add those DNS entries. So now I've fired up a browser in incognito just because I've done a lot of testing and sometimes the caching in Chrome, it doesn't clear it very well. But if we go to Headscale now, hopefully we're going to reach those URLs. And so here you can see Headscale and Headscale 2. I just gave these different URLs. This one is the admin one, and this one is the Headscale UI. Obviously, you can choose which one you want. The first thing you're going to need to do before any of this will work is to generate some API keys. As you see, API didn't succeed, and that's the same message in here, but it just defaults to putting this details in. So on this one, we want to go to settings and put in your key, and the same on here. Now, how do we get our key? Well, we need to hop into the CLI to do that. So let's go and do that right now. So to do that, we need to run the following command. So in my instance, sudo depends on whether you've got your user in the sudo docker group or not. We need to execute, and then this here needs to be the name of your container. In my instance, this is Headscale. Now you can't actually console into this container because it's a very minimalist image for security and footprint reasons, so we actually have to run and pipe the commands into it. So this is basically connecting into the container, and then this second part here is the command it's going to run inside that container. So we connect to it, and then we're going to run Headscale API keys create. So let's hit return. And you can see here that we've got the API key that we require. So we need to select that and we need to copy it. And now we can head back into our browser and we can paste this value in. So on the first machine, let's paste that in. We can see that that's right there. And in here, we need to put the address that our server is running on. So for me, that was https:// and it was tailscale.jimsgarage.co.uk. Now hopefully when I click save I get a green tick. Bingo, yes I do. So we can also roll over that API key if we wanted to and clear those and test a different server, whatever. I'm not going to do that, that's all up and running. So now I can go on users and device views, and that actually works because it's querying the server using those API credentials. So over on the other server, let's do the same thing. Let's paste that in there, and then again I'll put in my Tailscale URL. On this one I'm going to click save, and yeah, that's connected. Expiration is 3 months from now. Perfect. So a quick overview of the two different UIs. You can see in this one, all you get control of is the users and the devices. On the other one, but unfortunately, this one isn't working at the moment, I guess due to API changes. This one allows you to do users, nodes, deployments, and set the routes. Now, unfortunately, even when I create the routes later in this video through the CLI, those don't get reflected here again because those API calls are likely broken. We're on an alpha version, and I suspect that the alpha version is moving too quickly ahead of this UI. I imagine this will catch up soon, and you can obviously contribute to yourself if you want to help out this project. So from now on, we're going to stick to using this UI, but when we get onto things like the routes, we're going to have to go back into the CLI, so back into VS Code, execute into the container, and then run the commands that we need to connect to our various devices. So for starters though, we can use the user view here, so I can click a new user. So I'll do something like Pixel for my phone, and I'll click tick. Now this is exactly the same as using the CLI. It's simply making those calls in the background using the API. And so to prove that, if I go back now into my terminal and I run the command sudo docker exec back into Headscale, and I then do Headscale users create Ubuntu. If I run this, I'm not going to press return just yet. If we have a look back in here, we've only got this one user here. If I now run this command, that's created, user created. Now if we go back into the UI, if I just click off and then come back in, we now see Ubuntu. So that's exactly the same thing using this UI as it is in the command line interface. Similarly in here, we have some additional options. We can generate some pre-authorization keys. Now this is handy because we can create this user and create a key assigned with it, and then on any device in the future, we can use the connect command, so we can connect to the server and we can specify that pre-authorization key, and then it will automatically log that device in as this user we've created, which makes the whole process more seamless. You can also delete a user as well in the UI, and again that's calling the same sorts of things as that Headscale delete user, etc. So now that we've got two users set up, I'm going to show you now how to connect a mobile device and also how to connect a Ubuntu machine. You can also connect things like iOS devices, I don't have one, and things like Windows 11. So to get this working on Android, you simply need to download the Tailscale official app from the Play Store or iOS. Once you've loaded the app, you want to hit Get Started. It's then going to give you a warning saying that this can then control VPN access on your device, which is what you want, so hit OK. Now, when you do click OK, it's going to try and default login using the Tailscale domain. Now, we don't want to do that, so how do we fix that? Well, on this Android instance, we want to hit the X in the top right, which will take us back to the app. Now, in the top right, we want to hit the cog, and then we want to go to the accounts, and in the top right, we want to hit the dots, and we want to use an alternate server. Now, this alternate server, you guessed it, you're going to put in here your Tailscale server. So once you have that entered, you want to click Add Account. Now, when you do that, you can see it's automatically opened up a browser, and if I zoom in, it says you need to run the following command: Headscale nodes, register, username, and then it gives you a key. So this key is what you now need to add within your Headscale server. So I'm going to hop now back onto my machine and we're going to get this added. So as I said, that gave us a URL to register with. Now I've gone into the logs now on my Headscale container, and thankfully you can see the exact same thing that we just saw on that device. So here you can see this M key here. Let me just stop the logs a second. You can see this M key. So that is the key that this device is sending to register. Now that by itself isn't a security risk, because only the person who has access to this server, i.e. you and that Headscale where you exec into the container, only you have access to that. So don't worry too much about that. Let's make sure we've grabbed this code here, and we now need to get on to adding this. So because we've got the UI, we can actually go into the UI and we can actually do this through that. So for example, if we go onto here, we can click on the device view and we can add a new device. So I've clicked on that. I can now paste in that device key, which is there, and I'll say that this is my Pixel user, and then I can click tick. So now that user has been added. Now it's called it localhost. That's just unfortunately, I think, a bug in the Headscale deployment at the moment. There's an issue on GitHub for that, but you can rename that as well. But if we have a look on there, you can see that the IP address of my mobile phone, when it joined, etc., on all of those things. Now, we don't have any routes set up, so nothing much can happen at the moment, but we'll sort that soon. Let's dive now quickly back onto the mobile app and let's check what's happened now that we've added the device to our Headscale server, i.e. it's now a registered device. So now you'll see that we've got a notification that's come up. And this is just to help you manage this connection. So you'll get notifications when it joins, when it disconnects, etc. So I'm going to hit continue. And now you want to allow or not allow, obviously allow. And here you can see that this device is now connected. So in the top left, connected. I've also got the little key symbol on my notification bar in Android. You can see that this is Pixel and it's just at example.com. And you can see I've got the IP address of this device. Now you can do some options, like you see this drop down bar. You can click on exit node, and then you can tell this machine to be an exit node, this mobile phone. Now what that will do is allow other nodes on this network, this mesh network, to be able to use this as a gateway device, a bit like your home firewall router or a VPN service. So you can get this onto your mobile network, and then you could route local traffic out through this. And obviously you can extrapolate that across all your devices. If you had a friend in a different country in part of your mesh network, or you had a VPS in a data center somewhere, you could use that device as an exit node, which could be really handy for getting around geo-blocking and all of those sorts of things. So now that we have this running, I'm going to set this up now in a different machine, and then we should be able to see all three devices on our mesh network, and then we should be able to create some routes so that we can get this working. So on the screen now, you can see a new virtual machine. I've just called this one Tailscale Demo at the top, and I'm going to connect this one now to our Headscale network, and conveniently I've called this user Ubuntu. So now that we have this up and running, we can make use of the pre-authorization key. So in the background, we can click on this user here, we can click a pre-auth key, let's keep this one as always existing. It's going to expire on the 8th, so it's going to give us a day on this one. You can make it ephemeral or reusable if you want to. So let's create that key. So that's been created. I'm going to select this and copy it. And now we need to run the following command on our machine, our virtual machine that I've just showed you, to get this up and running. We will obviously need to install Tailscale first. So this is the command to install it, just taken from their official website. That will now go off, pull that and install it. Once that's completed, we should be able to now run the command. Now that's installed, we can do the sudo tailscale up, so that's going to spin this up. We specify -- login server and we set that to the URL of our Headscale server. We then use the auth key, which is this one, in the background. So hopefully when we hit return, that will now have connected. And if we go back in here now, yeah, we've got device view, we've got Tailscale demo, which is that machine I just created. So excellent. Lastly, we can set this up in Windows if we want. So let's create a user. Let's create a new one. We're going to call this one Windows. Let's hit the tick. So over on my Windows VM, let's go to the Tailscale website, go to download. Let's download it for Windows. Now that that's downloaded, it should just be a simple case of going through the installation wizard. So let's install that. Yep. By default, again, it's going to make us want to connect to the official site. So to click down here, it needs to log in, but we're not going to be able to do that. Now to get this running in Windows, we can't use the default login here. But if we visit tailscale.jimsgarage.co.uk/windows, it gives us the instructions for how we can get this working. Because we're running the recent version of Tailscale, version 1.34 and higher, we can actually run this command here. Otherwise, we have to do some funky stuff with the registry, which is a little bit old and clunky. So let's copy this command. So if we now hop into PowerShell, and if we paste this command in, let's hit return. You can see that Tailscale authentication is needed. Click the Tailscale icon to log in. So if we click the icon down here, it actually says here that we need to click on this link to authenticate, visit here. So if we actually click on this link, control and click in PowerShell, run the command below in the Headscale server to add this machine to your network. So we can copy and paste this machine here, this command. And now if we head back over to our VS Code, we can now do the sudo docker exec and then Headscale. And then we can run Headscale nodes register user. We can give it a username and then we paste in that key. So hopefully I can change this to be something useful. I think I used Windows, so let's hit return. And node win11 is now registered. So if we go back to Headscale and if we go back to users, we've got Windows here and we've now got this device here, win11, and there we've got the assigned user and the device name Windows. So now we have all three devices that are being shown. If we go into the other one as well, you can actually see all three of those are here as well. And unfortunately, the nodes and the deploys and the routes don't work at the moment, or at least there's something that I'm not doing that's right. So now if we hop over onto our VS Code, let's do some interesting commands to get this working. So if we do sudo docker exec, headscale, and then if we do a routes list, this should be blank because we don't actually have any routes. So if I now head over to my mobile device and I say run this as an exit node, I can now rerun that command and there you go. Remember, my phone is still called localhost confusingly. I should change that to make it more obvious. But now you can see that I've got a root available here. Now, if I go back into my virtual machine, I can now right click, and you can see down here, sorry it's quite small, that I'm now Windows on here, and you can see that the other network devices are there. So I've got the Pixel and Ubuntu. Now I can also say that I want to run this as an exit node. Are you sure? Running an exit mode means other devices in your Tailnode can send their traffic to this computer. You don't have to do this, remember. Tailscale is completely flexible, and you can choose how you want traffic to be routed. You might not want certain devices to have access to others, and you might not want certain devices to be able to squirrel out through you as an exit node. Now if we go back into VS Code, and now we run that, we should now have the Windows 11 exit node. And now what's cool is if I go into the bottom right here, and let's have a look at some of those network devices. So here's my phone and that Ubuntu machine. If I click on here, it's going to copy that IP address. And so we should, in theory, be able to ping this device. Yep, there we go. So this virtual machine is now pinging my mobile phone. These are actually on different subnets within my home network that are actually blocked by the firewall, but because they're now on this Headscale network, they're effectively on that mesh VPN, which my firewall doesn't see, so it's not blocking. So this is a separate network abstraction from that. And just to double check, why don't we have a look at the other device? So that Ubuntu machine, we can do a similar activity there, and we can ping that, and again we've got access to that device. So the final piece of the puzzle, let's get my Ubuntu machine. So we can do a sudo tailscale set advertise and exit node. That's now been done. And then in the background, hopefully if I run the routes list again, yeah, we've now got all three of those. The critical thing here is that it's not enabled. So all these routes exist, but they haven't been configured to be usable. And again, this is really cool because this is where you get complete configuration granularity over your rules. So you could only enable some of these routes on certain devices, or you could enable them on all. I'm going to enable them on all just for this demonstration, but obviously tailor this to your requirements. So the syntax for that is, again, we exec into the container, and then we run headscale routes enable -r for the root, and then we specify one of the IDs that are over here. So R1 should enable root 1. So now if we do the routes list, you can see that this node 1 is now true. So if I enable it for 2, well actually no, that will be 3, won't it? And then I also do it for 5. Now if I rerun that command, all of those should be enabled. Yeah, great. So every single one is enabled. Now what that allows me to do is if I hop back onto my virtual machine, now in the bottom right, and again, sorry, it's small. Now if I right click that and go to exit nodes, you'll now see that I have these other ones here. So for example, I could now say the Pixel, my phone, is the exit node. So now all of my traffic is going to be routed, so we know that it can reach it from up here, but now all of my traffic on this machine will be routed out through my mobile phone, which is pretty awesome. And this is how it's going to work with when I set up that co-location for my NAS. So now we have 3 devices that are all joined to the same Headscale network. They're all using the Tailscale client, and all of this is hosted internally within our own network. Nothing else has visibility of our traffic. Also, then we can route traffic wherever we want within that network, which is especially great if you want to share this with other people. You've got total control. So hopefully now you've got everything you need to be able to set up Headscale across all of your devices using the official Tailscale app. This gives you a great setup whereby you can create granular rules for all of your devices and also other people or other devices that you don't own. This is going to form the backbone for what I'm setting up in the next video, where I'm going to be creating a NAS which I'm going to be storing outside of my LAN. So effectively this is my own private cloud for my storage that could be basically located anywhere. Now there's obviously going to be some port forwarding that you'll need for this to work, i.e. you'll need to expose the right ports on your firewall, make sure that that URL is reachable. I've shown before in previous videos about how to do port forwarding, and it's going to depend on what your firewall is, but basically the process is pretty straightforward and the same. So once you do have that set up, the beauty of this as well is that it's always going to be phoning home. So basically I'll set up my NAS, I'll get Tailscale up and running first, and then when I put it out in the field, as long as I've got my port forwarding correct, it should be able to then connect back into my network, and I'll always have a constant VPN connection. The beauty of that is it's kind of two-way. If I set up my routes, it will connect into my network, and I'll also be able to connect out to it, which will be great for remote administration. And it also means that I don't need to set up port forwarding on wherever I decide to put this. If you put it at your parents' house, for example, you don't need to worry about port forwarding. This will all be taken care of. A bit like how we've used Tailscale to get around CGNAT before. Anyway, I hope you liked this demonstration and you saw a bit more this time about how to get the web UI up. Now, I don't know whether I'm being a noob or whether it's just because of the different API versions that are constantly changing. Hopefully those apps will get updated and you'll be able to use the UI for all of it. But again, I've only just scratched the surface on Tailscale. There's a ton of documentation, a ton of commands we didn't even look at, but this should give you the basics to get it up and running and give you some basic rudimentary controls around where your traffic can be routed. Let me know if this is something that you're going to be using, and why and how. I am also going to be touching on other competitors. I know I've done things in the past, but things like Zero Tier and Netbird, those are things you're asking me to look at, so I will be taking a look at that. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. If you found this useful, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.